Welcome to Dev's Advocate, where we talk to independent game developers about themselves and their games. My name is Eric,
And my name's Anthony.
and today we have a very special guest. Alia is a good friend of mine, and I'm thrilled to talk to her about all the crazy video game development adventures that she's been a part of. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited
I
to be here.
I think you're the only game developer I know with a PhD.
Yeah, I didn't even know you could get a PhD in game dev.
Yeah, I mean you can. It's not like there's no game development disciplines out there yet, but you can essentially defend a dissertation in game development from other adjacent disciplines like art history or communications.
Okay, that makes sense.
So do you want to just do your best to give us like a Cliff Notes version of what it is that your thesis was about and what it is that you're trying to convey with it?
Hmm. So my thesis was kind of trying to combine game development with communication studies because my native department where I defended my dissertation is communication and culture slash digital media because my committee was from both departments. And I guess I was trying to treat game development as a communication discipline because, in a way, all games are multimodal objects. Multimodality essentially is a study of how a media object conveys a meaning. For instance, a media object can be really anything, but it's more and more prevalent right now with games and electronic literature. For instance, I mean, a, a multimodal object can be a newspaper. You see a newspaper, you see text, you see images. It combines different ways of meaning making. So we call it a multimodal object. And games, in that sense, are multimodal objects because you encounter many different channels of meaning making. For instance, music, dialogue, visuals, the actual game mechanics. So I guess in my dissertation, what I was trying to explore is the meaning making potential of games. Um, because games definitely employ different channels for meaning making, as I already mentioned. Like you can evoke very emotional feelings with music, or with story, and how games achieve that. I was really interested in that. So this is what essentially my dissertation in a nutshell is about. I was trying to look at the games from the perspective of multimodal communications.
Is this because you are a gamer or a game developer?
First and foremost, I would say I was interested in this topic because I was a gamer.
Okay.
I got into game development as I kept investigating. Um, Actually, like I'll explain, I guess, my entryway. Before I decided to do my dissertation in game development, my primary discipline was English and literature.
Mhm.
And how I got into games is that my ex boyfriend at the time, he was heavily into games. And I remember I had an English exam the next day, like at 8 a.m., and my boyfriend convinced me to play Dragon Age. Yeah, he's like, "Oh, you'll relax, let's see how it is. You love this game." And at first, I was so skeptical. I'm like, "Oh, again with your games." And as I kept playing, I got into it more and more, and actually got consumed in the plot so much that it emotionally grabbed me, and things that
Mhm.
happened in the games actually affected my emotional well-being by the time I was done playing. Like I'm not gonna be spoiling the plot of the game itself, but there were a couple of strange things that happened inside of the game that sort of really confused me a lot, and I I was left affected by it for many days after. And I'm like, what, why is this happening? Like, why am I feeling this way? So I really wanted to investigate more of how this happens in games. So I guess I came from being just a gamer in a way, and gradually start getting involved more and more with development as I kept investigating, because a lot of what games do is connected with game mechanics and how games essentially are coded and how they're designed and the decisions that developers make along the way.
So tell us a little bit about the defense, because uh, I watched it, and those guys are like, I mean, I know it's their job, but they were trying to like rip you and your thesis apart. It seemed like.
Some tried, and some were genuinely trying to push me to the kind of to exploring more of what maybe I didn't say in my dissertation.
Hmm.
So, I mean, there was only one person that really tried to rip me apart, and I actually did not expect that. Others were kind of just trying to push me more to talk about things that I did not necessarily mention in my dissertation and my defense. Uh, Defense overall is a fairly stressful time because you essentially
Hmm.
have to condense your entire dissertation into a 15-minute presentation, and be very quick and concise about it and make sure that you put all the right points in it. Obviously, the committee is supposed to read your dissertation beforehand,
Hmm.
but that summary that you probably watched in the very beginning of the dissertation, sorry, defense, it's pretty much essential to your defense because you basically have 15 minutes to tell everything that they need to know about it, and
Right.
then they're gonna be grilling you with questions.
And you got to be ready to answer them, right? You got to.
Yeah, yes, for sure. So I guess what I did not expect, that there was at least one committee member that kind of tried to fail me in a way, because he really disagreed with my angle and my sort of outlook on those things,
Hmm.
which I mean I respect, but like, I mean, the whole fact that someone tried to fail me or someone disagrees with me doesn't make my dissertation any less valid. So
Right.
Uh, but actually, most of the committee members, they were just trying to make me talk more about things that I did not mention. For instance, the intersectionality that is usually used in feminist theory.
Hmm.
I did mention it in my dissertation, but not from the perspective of feminist theory per se, because there's a lot of adjacent terms in game development and humanities. For instance, multimodality, for once, because it's used not only to describe human modes of communication, like actually speech, gesture, posture, all those things, but multimodality is also used a lot in programming. Because programming interfaces to, for instance, respond to speech, it is a multimodal discipline.
Hmm.
So because there's a lot of adjacent terms in development and in humanities, there was a lot of confusion, there were a lot of questions. For instance, intersectionality, because as I mentioned, it is a feminist term, it is used in feminist theory, but it is also term signifying intersectional properties of certain disciplines or studies. And that's not necessarily aligned to feminist theory.
Hmm.
So I guess a lot of confusion um and a lot of kind of maybe not really hostile but more like critical treatment came
Hmm.
from terms same terms having different meanings in different disciplines, and my entire committee, pretty much except one member, were from humanities. I had only
Hmm.
one applied developer on the committee. So yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
I guess gaming as like a communication modal. Um, how should we as game developers think about um, developing our game not as like just a way to get to the end state of the game where it says you finished or whatever the end state is versus developing it as like a storytelling. If I'm making a racing game, should I try to add storytelling in there? As you say, should I try to make the player feel X, or do I just kind of leave that up to the player to interpret it?
That's actually a very interesting question. Thank you for asking that. Um, Because this is something that some of my students already asked me. I used to teach web development in Seneca College, and part of that web development course was dedicated to interactive art and games as well, where we kind of made a little bit of a gaming project. And I guess a lot of my students also sort of not necessarily agreed with me that games supposed to be about storytelling and communications. By no means I
Mhm.
think that it's like gospel. Um, Definitely some developers and some programmers like games purely for the mechanics and basically the say what you mentioned, the games about racing. They not necessarily have to be about stories. So I don't think that as a developer you should be concerning yourself with putting more story into the games where you feel story is not necessary. But that being said, there definitely will be players that will be experiencing games from the perspective of story, regardless of of whether that story ended up in games or not. So it's definitely one of the aspects that some players cling to. The It's not necessarily that you have to, I guess, work around your development principles, basically work around that and basically put story in your games if this is not basically how you operate.
Right.
Um, but that being said, players definitely do experience games in more than one way. Um, some players, at least. So there definitely will be players that will be clinging to stories more than experience.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I was watching the High Score documentary on Netflix today.
Mhm.
I don't know if you guys have seen it.
No,
I
not me.
haven't.
It's a multi part documentary series about the history of video games, and they were interviewing somebody who was working on like the old like Sega Genesis Madden games and stuff.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And he started talking about like the story of a sports game, not in a literal narrative sense, but in a when you play it and that contest and just earning those points, that in itself tells a story, right?
That's true. Yep.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I would say it's more on a cultural level, though, in a way how games do affect society, which is definitely one of the layers that I do talk about in my dissertation, because basically, I kind of proposed a certain game development model in my dissertation that has to do with both developing narrative inside of the game, as well as what happens to the games as they transcend um, the the gameplay experience and become cultural objects. So what you say, Eric, actually resonates with me in terms of like cultural transcendence, because um, even games without any stories in them, like racing car games um, um, or invaders, for instance, they do have cultural trail and they do become part of our cultures, and they basically start having their own stories of how this game originated, what kind of cultural impact it made, which obviously doesn't have to do with whether this game had any narrative in that game itself. But yeah, it's definitely going to be resonating, and it's going to become a story that sort of we culturally tell ourselves.
Could you pull out something almost like as a piece of advice for indie devs specifically that you could say, through the process of writing this and the games I developed, these are the key takeaways I got in terms of game development, maybe like the path or the emotion or just the work ethic that you need to put in, something like that?
Mhm. Well, maybe my key points would not necessarily be, uh, the kind of work that you have to put in a development, but I guess broadly, games are effective because um, they do involve a player participating in them and exploring games through interaction. Second point would be games are cultural objects. So, I mean, as developers, we usually design games with certain strategy in mind, but a lot of games become key elements to the culture and, in a sense, start having lives of their own, like books would or films would. Thirdly, game meaning is composed not only by the developer but also by the player. And in a way, as soon as the developer done developing a game, it can gain additional meaning and additional stories attached to it that are outside of the developer's control. So I guess those would be three key point takeaways that, with the third point that I would like to emphasize again, that the games are shared objects in a way, that
Mhm.
there's definitely a thing as a developer's intent, but once the game is released, it's sort of under the control of a player, what kind of meaning to make out of this game.
Yeah, otherwise it's completely pointless. You wouldn't write a game really for yourself. You want the people to enjoy it and to explore it.
Yeah, for sure. But also, for instance, um, I do know of a couple of just stories from game journalism where a developer did not intend his game to be played or to be experienced in a certain way, but here were the players generating massive paratexts about the game in a way the developer didn't want them to. But
Right.
you know, we can't really do anything about games after they're being experienced by players and
Mhm.
sort of transcend the developer's control.
Yeah, that's been a bit of a struggle I find with a lot of developers is the whole um, when the players deviate from the developer's intent, but
Mhm.
then, that's how they end up having fun, and maybe that's even what makes the game popular in the first place. And, is there anything wrong with that, right? Like,
I don't think there is anything wrong with it whatsoever, but I do know that some developers, for instance, try to mechanically, basically artificially, to influence the game from the perspective of mechanics in order to restrict certain ways of how players can experience it. Case in
mhm.
point, actually, the first game that I seriously got into when I was 16 was World of Warcraft. I really dumped all my time into it for a very long
I was
time.
I was just gonna say Blizzard is who you're talking about.
Yes. And I remember, like my character was rogue, and I remember back then you still could experience the game without really doing well. I mean, not without doing quests, but um, one of the kicks that I was getting out of the World of Warcraft is that I was completing almost all the quests in a stealth mode. Because back then you could still pickpocket NPCs for quest items.
Oh, no
Um,
way.
so in a way, instead of fighting monsters, I was pickpocketing them. But yeah, but I think I got to something like level 30 or something. So I was doing it like persistently for a long time. But at some point, this mechanic was sunsetted because it was not a valid way of experiencing a game, and like I'm not sure if this was a right decision on a Blizzard's part,
Mhm.
but the truth is that developers do sometimes um, artificially tweak mechanics in order to
Mhm.
make the game suitable to their vision.
Yeah, that comes back to the point you keep making about trying to make the player feel X rather than letting the player experience something genuine.
Mhm.
Mhm.
All right. So, um, let's get to know you, Alia, better. So, I mean, I know you. You're my good friend, and I know how many different, projects and endeavors you're always involved with, largely musical, but also, all sorts of multimodal things.
Yeah.
Um, well, okay. Well, first of all, you actually developed two games as counterparts to your dissertation, right? So let's
Yes.
just talk about them for a little bit. If
Mhm. Okay. So yeah, as you know already, both games were developed in the course of my dissertation, sort of to prove some of my points that I was making in the dissertation itself. Um, that being said, though, obviously each game, the Kodama and Cat game, were more representative of my interests and my creativity rather than me just dryly trying to reiterate something or
hmm,
prove something for my dissertation. Kodama, I guess the idea came to me when I was in Tokyo, in Japan. I was actually touring because I'm a touring musician as well. and I play with like a dark wave project from UK called Attrition, and I perform with my solo project as well. So Kodama pretty much came to me when I was on tour, and I was um, again to my point that games are multimodal objects. I was inspired by the fusion of Japanese folklore, just the experience of being in Japan itself, as well as I'm not sure if you're familiar with the band Alcest. They released an album called Kodama, inspired by Miyazaki cartoons in turn. So, in a way, that fusion of combinations and experiences is what really, really inspired me to make Kodama happen. Plus, it was pre-COVID times, and I guess I was sort of um, sorry if my cat is disturbing you. By the
Is
way,
that a cat or a baby?
Yeah,
he's
that's
a
a cat.
cat. So the experience of being in Japan itself sort of really inspired that, as well as again, it was a pre-COVID time, and kind of a lot of my peers and a lot of my supervisors kind of almost experienced that something is gonna happen. They almost felt it in a way that
Mm.
you know climate change started becoming more and more of a problem, and media was writing about it a lot. So it's almost like you feel that something is about to happen, you just don't know what.
Mhm.
So I guess Kadama was partially inspired by that feeling of like something is about to happen, I just don't know what. And a lot of what Kadama is about is just being angry at the general state of humanity and what humans do. Um,
Mhm.
so that's why I guess the character of Kadama itself is not human. In Japanese folklore, Kadamas are kind of like dryads, um, but it's sort of a dryad that is directly responsible for the forests. So in Japanese folklore, again, they had this superstition that if you cut if you basically cut forests for development, right, and if you destroy
Mhm.
natural resources, that Kadama will inevitably become angry, and Kadama
Mhm.
are the spirit protectors of the forest. So in my game, I kind of try to turn the tables a little bit, and it's essentially about this vengeful forest spirit that awakens at some point and realizes that humanity just gone too far, and trees are almost extinct, and Kadama is being awakened to take some kind of action. So, kind of in my game, I sort of encourage the player to identify with the vengeful spirit of forest instead of humans, because a lot of what Kadama does in games is like killing humans essentially in order to regrow the forests. So,
Mhm.
kind of intervening with content development projects, burning them, um, whacking them with a hammer, and it's all supposed to be kind of tongue in cheek and slapstick.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so that's what Kadama is largely about. I mean, I enjoyed making it because I can be a very angry person sometimes, and it definitely helped me to get over a lot of really
So
weird pent up feelings about this. So
it's cathartic that way?
Yeah, I feel like I got to know you a little bit by playing that game.
yeah, and I guess also by the end of the game, um there's in a way no happy endings for humans, and I sort of wanted to make it very obvious, um because essentially the only two game choices you have is to use help to get rid of the humans, or to do it more manually and to get rid of the humans. So either way you get the same cutscene in the end, with like
Mhm.
Kadama feasting either by herself or with the pet, with the potted plant pet,
Mhm.
and sort of celebrating the regrowing the forests, whatever it might mean for humanity.
So, obviously, I mean, from the sounds of it, it sounds like the theme of it was what kind of drove the development of it, right? Which
Yeah.
makes sense, but so how did that then, instruct the mechanics? Like, for you as a developer, how did you, uh, come up with the core mechanics based on wanting to convey the message that you did.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, it was definitely more storytelling driven process rather than me starting with mechanics and sort of
Hmm.
trying to determine what would be best for the game mechanically. In that way, actually, it I do acknowledge that it taxed the game mechanics a bit for me because I was so much more interested in exploring the story of what's happening in the game and Kodama being angry and just destroying humans rather than trying to brainstorm interesting mechanics for this to happen. So in a way, I guess it partially ties back to being slapstick. It's kind of like hack
Hmm.
and slash for the most part. Um,
Hmm.
there is not as much like persistent mechanics there as, for instance, in Cat Game, which is the second game that I developed.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, but in a way, I guess the game aspect in Kadama plays out in the hack and slash way, right? It's basically I
Right.
just wanted to gamify. I know it would sound bad, but I wanted to gamify killing humans over growing forests. So
It's okay.
yeah, I mean, I'm not homicidal in real life, I swear. Um,
That's what games are for.
Yeah,
exactly.
keep it virtual.
Yeah. Yeah. So in a way, there's not as many persistent mechanics as in the other game. Yeah, because it was mostly storytelling driven.
Kodama, like I felt really came from inside you, maybe like that's really how you felt. Was it the same thing with Cat Game? You mentioned that this game felt right as you were developing it. So, I mean, what about it kind of felt right?
Okay. What felt right? I mean, Cat Game is also, I guess, coming from a dark place, sort of like Kadama, except when Kadama was mostly about anger and frustration. Cat Game was mostly about delving deeper into those kind of like fairly dark um, topics, more as a bystander rather than an active participant in it. So that's why the protagonist of a cat game is Cat. And throughout the game, the cat doesn't fight because cats, well, they can't really fight a lot of things. I mean, they can fight raccoons
Mm.
and stuff, but for instance, against against quintessentially gamey things like guns or anything, like they're pretty useless. So I was, yeah. So I was basically trying to avoid fighting in that game mechanic completely. And in a way, it's more of a electronic literature rather than a game. I mean, there's still some gaming mechanics there, but you're not fighting your enemies. You're kind of mostly exploring what happened. The idea behind the cat game is that the cat at some point wakes up in the apartment and realizes that like the cat's owner is gone and didn't leave the cat any food. And the cat's quest essentially is looking for food. And while the cat is looking for food, it's discovering a bunch of really dark things that, happened with society because all humans are gone and cat doesn't understand why. And it's kind of, I mean, in a sense, cat is not really interested to seek out the mysteries of where the humans went. It's interested to get food. But as a player, when you play from the perspective of cat, like I wanted to make sure that you can't help but wonder what actually happened, and you sort of
Mhm.
discover the story as you're adventuring with the cat trying to find food.
Uh, what's the status on the development of it, right? Because it's not, or at least the version that's available right now is not yet complete?
Yes, it's not yet complete because there's two more zones that need development, and
Mm.
there's still cutscenes that need development as well. And because cutscenes is a significant part of the game, it's
Mhm.
sort of not looking very complete without them. I would say there's probably about 2 to 3 months worth of work on it left. And most of it is really just cleaning up and adding like additional subplots that
Mhm.
does not influence the main plot much, as well
Mhm.
as just the, like again inserting those cutscenes, for instance. that
Mhm.
are not mechanically very significant, but still very significant to the player experience. And I will be actually finishing it. Like I have plans of working on it next weekend and the weekend after that, um, because I actually also have a bit of a talk for my PhD colleagues class about
Mm.
cat game, and
Okay.
whether I want it or not, I have to like clean up some of the things that make players really confused, um, and just like remove the testing objects from the game, which I
Mhm.
just left there without kind of thinking about it twice.
Mhm.
But yeah, thankfully the most of what I wanted to put in the game is already there. Now I just have to make sure to clean up the experience because um, obviously it does feed into the how player experiences the game and sort of um,
Mhm.
is probably not very um, I guess it doesn't make the game look complete or as a complete text or piece of game literature kind of.
Mhm.
Is there a motive behind this game? Like with Kodama, it's clear what you kind of wanted to convey. What did you want to convey with Cat Game?
I guess I wanted to give more of a non-human perspective on how things are kind of screwed in a lot of sense, in a lot of
Okay.
ways. So because cat doesn't have any human interest at heart and it's sort of there by itself, just looking for food, doing its cat things, finding toys that range from an eye on a stick to like radioactive candies or something. That basically it's a way of, I guess, putting a mirror against society to sort of show how a lot of things are really weird and really strange, especially that now that cat experiences them and sort of can pass judgment on it. Um, but also this game actually started way before pandemic and way before things escalated on many levels, including like political and with anti-masker protests. That like a pandemic definitely put that mirror on society, even
Mm.
without cat game being there. But cat game started even before all that happened. So in a way, my supervisor, for instance, really tried to encourage me to finish it faster because for her it was almost prophetic how cat
Mm.
game sort of feeds into this whole experience that maybe of not really hopelessness in a way, but kind of I think that over pandemic a lot of us realized that um, society is kind of a bit more torn and more divided than we thought before, and a lot of things, um, like for instance, still rising prices on housing even during the pandemic, mass evictions is just wrong, but it's still the
Mhm.
extension and continuation of capitalist system and just how capitalism operates. And a lot of, I guess, things that happen inside of cat game, from radioactive barbecue for workers to weird experiments in the labs, sort of, albeit like it's very grotesque portrayal of like issues that society is like subject is a subject to, but it's sort of in a similar vein, right? That like so many things are
Mhm.
profit driven that we sort of don't kind of stop and think about it.
Yeah. So I was gonna ask. I don't even know if it needs to be asked anymore. I was gonna ask, like, because the both of these games, were obviously come from a very personal place, right? And
Hmm.
um, so I was gonna ask, were they made to be experienced by other people? Which it sounds like they are. It sounds like it's more than just a piece of art that you're creating for yourself. That it's something that you want people to experience and maybe take away from some kind of a, I don't want to say like a moral lesson, but something to think about.
Hmm. Well, I mean, definitely games come from personal place,
Mhm.
but they came from personal places for a lot of game developers, and some of
Mhm.
those games do have stories, other games don't have stories. right? So in a way, it's definitely, I treated it more, I guess, as a form of communication, like you would treat writing your music.
Mhm.
But I also wanted the player to experience them and sort of feel them through, because I believe that interactive fiction and interactive media, including games, but also interactive art installations, it does have a bigger capacity for changing minds.
Mhm.
And I write about it in my dissertation as well. That actually a lot of people wrote papers on that, including G, who's a fairly prominent scholar in game development. Basically, he talks more of the Assassin's Creed game in a way that when you put a player in a position where they have to experience how it is to be an assassin and hide and do certain things that are specific to that particular character, you can't help but sort of leave that character's experience and emphasize with them and sort of understand more what's happening and why it's happening, and how do you relate to different um, subplots within the game, knowing what you know, experiencing the character that you experience.
Mhm.
So in a way, definitely putting a player in a certain position to see whatever happens in the game from the perspective of cat or a vengeful forest spirit, that was part of a goal. um,
Mhm.
that being said, um, I do think that more story driven games, as opposed to games that maybe combine story with a lot of mechanics and exciting mechanical um, I guess subplots, and just the games that are pleasure to experience more, would have much bigger reach than just simply
Mhm.
story driven games.
Mhm.
That being said, though, like there's definitely series of um, those more personal games, like Depression Quest,
Right.
like the Coming Out game, where it's essentially mostly about queer experiences, but the game itself revolves around generating different stories of how your coming out can happen. You know, you can have supportive parents,
Mhm.
you can have non-supportive parents, you can have supportive friends or not supportive friends, and that would sort of shape partially your experience as a player.
Mhm.
um Again, is this a game with exciting mechanics that is a pleasure to play and experience and replay? Perhaps. But is it a game that sort of puts the player in a position of a character and makes them feel what the character feels and act in the best interest of the character? Yeah, for sure.
So you're not monetizing these games, right? Or do you plan to do that?
I'm not
R-
monetizing these games. No.
right. So then what are your ambitions with them?
I guess I just want them to be out there because they're partially part of my history with games and my experience in developing them. And
Mhm.
partially, I think that they do have um, a bit of a critical potential as well.
Mhm.
So I want just them to be there, to be played, and kind of to be there to represent different types of games. But a lot of other games that I am sort of working on slash brainstorming currently, they probably will be monetized because they're more of they're less of a story based games and more of an experience based games.
Mhm.
Um, Now that you're 2 games in, plus all the games, that I think you mentioned you kind of started, stopped, plus your dissertation, um, what is the process that you would say, uh, indie game developers, specifically ones that are kind of starting for the first time, should follow? You asked the question, should we start with the tile set or the characters? Is there any actual good path that you've found, or is it kind of just do a little bit of everything at once and just see where it goes?
I don't think that there is one path that fits all, simply because different developers do develop games differently and they're inspired by different things. I would personally suggest looking into game development and game design frameworks. Like I mentioned at least three of them in my dissertation, and I developed another one. Or actually, I mentioned four of them, and I developed like a fifth one. Um,
Okay.
so definitely, I mean, maybe even not for following them to the T. It's just interesting to see what kind of frameworks are available to organize the process of development better. That being said, I believe that not a single framework will really give you like a shortcut path to how to do this. So, as much as it should be used more for familiarizing yourself with how different people formulated the approach to game development, you should still like run it by yourself and think whether it resonates with you or not. Um, that being said, like besides the game development framework that I formulated for for just folks to explore and see if it sticks and it resonates, I also provided a few of different approaches of how people can, how game developers can um, design their own approach around developing games. And so I suggested extrapolation as one of the strategies. So basically,
Right.
it's when you say, watch the movies that you like the most and see how they, for instance, approach dialogue and extrapolate from there and try to export as much as you see from the surrounding media into your own development process to export things that you like. Um, as well as research. Research is a very big one. So if you're making games about any kind of scientific topics, research is that tool that would give you definitely more creativity, as well as kind of trying to ground your games and limitations, which again boosts creativity in the end anyway, because
Mhm.
limitations drive better design. Um, when it comes to what you should approach first, tiles or music or anything, again, because we're developing games, like all developers work very differently. Having a good planning software, like I use Jira a lot because
Right.
this is, I guess, what I use for my main job. I'm a software developer. So just having a very clean path of what you do and when, it really helps with development. Um, so organizing the approach that works for you, organizing it well, and breaking goals into smaller manageable tasks, probably the main takeaways that I would suggest to any developer. Other than that, mileage really varies depending on development style. I do know game developers that approach music first. I do know game
Mhm.
developers that approach music last. Um, but basically, regardless of how those different pieces fit into your narrative, having a consistent plan saves a lot of time.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of ClickUp right now. It's really saves me a lot.
Oh, ClickUp. I never heard of it actually.
I'm a Trello guy.
Trello. I've never used Trello. This is the first like planning software I've used, and I don't know like what I was doing before.
Hmm. That's cool. Yeah, I'll check it out. Not familiar.
So you're working on some other stuff right now. I'm guessing you're not quite ready to make your game, like the upcoming games, public yet?
No, no, not quite, not quite
Okay.
ready. Um,
All right. Fair
there
enough.
was there was one game that I was working on, but actually, yeah, that's the thing with my games. I really have to like filter them out in terms of the messages that I put out, because sometimes it can be just angry. I can design a game, and then I would be a little bit too sheepish to actually put it out there. Um, I'll give you an example. So I had collect three game, um, where sort of the game premise was like help the grumpy cat remove the trash. Um, and there was this grumpy cat with like a LGBTQ cappy on it, and part of the trash you were removing, for instance, like one of the like collect three icons was Trump's head,
Oh,
and
I
you
was
like
gonna
can
say
collect,
Trump hat.
yeah, and you can collect three of them and remove them, kind of as a pass of a trash, as a part of a trash. And I'm like, this is too cheeky. I can't really put it out there.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
yeah. So in a way, I guess I have to. I often end up with developing projects and then filtering them out because it's, you know, too inappropriate or too cheeky, and because I'm an angry
Mm.
developer, so I develop things in anger and then I look at whether they're appropriate or not. Um, yeah. So not ready to say yet what I'm working on, but hopefully soon I will be. and I'll keep you in mind to send you
Hmm.
screenshots or any demos if I have them. So I'm excited.
Awesome. Yeah, that's exciting. All right. So, just as a last thing, just well, actually, you know what? Like one of our part of our mission for this podcast is getting to know the developers, and you told us a lot about yourself as a developer, but um, can you tell us a little bit about like what inspired you? I know you mentioned Dragon Age, right? But what are some of your other inspirations as a creative in general?
Hmm. So definitely BioWare games is a huge part behind my inspirations in general, because BioWare used to be known for very story driven, very effective gameplays. I mean, I haven't played BioWare games in a while, but some of my
Hmm.
friends did tell me that it kind of went downhill from there.
Hmm.
I'm not sure. I haven't passed my judgment yet. But a lot of games like Dragon Age, Mass Effect is a huge one for me. In the past, I mean, my ex-boyfriend was really into Baldur's Gate, so he told me a lot of
Hmm.
sub stories from that game, but I actually haven't played it myself. It's more like he was really excited to talk about it, so I know a lot about the game. I
Hmm.
haven't played it myself.
Mhm.
Um,
What are you playing right now?
right now, I'm playing Untitled Goose Game.
Oh.
Amazing.
Yeah. I'm not sure what I think about it yet, but as soon as I'm ready, I'll probably jot a post about it or something.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So a lot of it is BioWare. Some of it is also like, it would sound pretty weird, but I do play a lot of collect 3 games just for relaxation. For instance, when I feel stressed and I'm
Hmm.
taking a 5-minute work break, like I play either Bejeweled or something along the lines, because it's actually my first
Hmm.
introduction to video games was on a very old weird Russian computer. I don't because I'm from Russia. I was born there. So we had this game called Lines, where it's essentially a collect 5, I think. Was
Mm.
developed by like Russian programmers, and in that game you just collect the colorful balls, and it's just kind
Mm.
of very hypnotizing and relaxing for me ever since
Yeah.
I first experienced it. So yeah.
No, no, that makes sense. I'm the same way with Tetris.
Yeah. I actually
It's
heard
like,
that Tetris, because when you play Tetris, like fitting things together occupies that same space in short-term memory that
mm,
usually trauma is occupying. So
mm,
basically, Tetris is being used to uh, heal PTSD.
Wow. That's
PTSD,
amazing.
sorry. Yeah.
mhm.
So it's pretty promising. I'm kind of really curious where that research goes.
Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna read up on that.
Mhm.
And yeah, lastly, like, uh, just is there anything else that you wanna plug, gaming or otherwise? I know you recently released a single, Stop Go.
Yeah. So I guess that's sort of, I'm used to compartmentalize myself. So I'm not only game developer, I'm also musician, and actually quite a couple of projects that I'm currently thinking about will be very connected to music,
Mm,
and the music that I release. So in a way, it's maybe gonna be somewhere between a game and interactive album. Um,
okay.
yep. So I release music. I recently released a single, which some folks that reviewed it find sort of reminiscent of early Bjork. Um,
Mm.
I think someone even said that it's kind of like, what if Bjork would sing for Nine Inch Nails? So
Wow.
if you're curious, check it out. I will be also releasing more of an ambient, some of the ambient stuff that um, I've composed a few tracks, and I kind of just want to slowly portion them out and not dumping everything at the same time. So definitely, like, if you want to follow me on Facebook, it's Alia Synesthesia. Um, and you can stay on top of everything in terms of like my music work as well as my game work, because I promote everything there. Um, yeah, other than that, um, I might be doing soon kind of more of a film soundtrack for Haxan. I just recently got my Twitch channel, so I stream DJ mixes there as well as maybe some of the like kind of semi live performances. Um, the Twitch channel is also under Alia Synesthesia, so by all means check it out. There's at least one DJ set there. And if I will be playing or developing any games anytime soon, I will probably also put some of that on Twitch. So win-win either way. You get some music or you get some more stuff, some
Hmm.
more information about games.
Very cool.
Yay!
Awesome. Yeah, we'll link to all of that in the description.
Thank you.
So, all right. I guess that's it. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. I still have a lot more questions, but maybe we'll get you back in.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, sure. I'll be glad to be here.
So this has been Dev's Advocate, where we talked with Alia Synesthesia. My name is Eric.
And my name's Anthony.
Take care, everyone.